Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to go over chapter 11 in the textbook on bureaucracy. And the required reading for this week is The Birth of the Administrative State by Ronald Pistrito. Pistrito actually went and got his degree in political science at Claremont Graduate University as well. So that's why I read him in graduate school, because my professors know him. But so I just want to show you the PowerPoint, or we're going to be going over the PowerPoint. Now there's 6 sections in the article that I want you to go over. Introduction, arbitrary government versus the rule of law, securing the rule of law, and the separation of powers, the progressives' rejection of the separation of powers, beyond civil service reform, the separation of politics and administration, and the administration and the living constitution. These are 6 sections of the article I want you to go over. It's a long article, so if you want to read the whole article, that's fine with me. You're more than welcome to do that. But in terms of what I want you to focus on for the discussion forums this week, these are the 6 sections I want you to focus on. And so it's not too long. It's not as long as it would be reading the whole thing, obviously. And so I have explanations of each section in the PowerPoint as well. Okay, so let's get started on, how do I, it's covered right there. Bureaucracy, okay. This is something that keeps popping up on my laptop. I don't know what it is, but I apologize. It's going to stay there. Okay, bureaucracy. So I like using that GIF or that meme because I hate bureaucracy. That's why I vote for big government, right? And what that meme really means is bureaucracy is sort of, the growth of bureaucracy is indicative in the growth of government. Right? And I'll get into that today. So bureaucracy is a form of organization. It's a complex structure of offices, tasks, and rules. And so it's not just in government, right? I'm sure wherever you work, if you do work, there is bureaucracy that you have to deal with. And they make rules and regulations on how things, on how to make things function more effectively, whether at a company or in government, right? And so we're going to be specifically talking about bureaucracy in government this week, and that Congress writes laws that are often very broad, right? In other words, a theme of this week, a theme of the past couple of weeks, is that Congress has been delegating its authority to the president and to bureaucracy over the past 100 years or so, more so in the last 50 years or so. So when you see Congress and the laws that they produce, they're often very broad, and they leave it to executive agencies, independent agencies in government, to come up with the nitty-gritty stuff, right? So in other words, it's often up to bureaucracy to define what the policy will mean in practice, right? So, and like I said, the purpose of bureaucracy, right, is to ensure fair and accountable administration, right? And so how do we put this in practice? So let's say Congress passes, a budget, and they provide, I don't know, $50 million in transportation. That's nothing, right? But they allocate the funding, right? But they don't say how specifically that funding should be used. Who do they leave that to? They leave that to the Department of Transportation, which is an executive agency. It's a bureaucracy in government, right? And they're the ones that will come up with the rules and regulations on what to do with that funding from Congress, right? Another example would be education, right? Congress can provide X amount of money, right, for education, public education funding in this country. But who's the Secretary of Education? in the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos. She has overarching power over how that money is used, even though Congress is the one that gave the department that funding, right? Okay, maybe that's better. All right, so what do? Right? They implement laws, they determine how to administer and enforce laws, they make rules, right? Like I said earlier, Congress can write and legislate pretty broadly, and then they leave the nitty-gritty, detailed stuff to bureaucracies to take care of, right? So they make the rules, they have processes of rulemaking that often get very political, right? And they enforce laws, right? And so the EPA held Volkswagen, right, a private company, accountable for falsifying vehicle emissions levels in 2015. I don't know if you remember that, right? That wasn't Congress that held Volkswagen accountable. It was the EPA. It's an executive agency. It's a bureaucracy in government that held a private company personally accountable, right? And so if we go back a bit, what does it look like that do these three things look familiar? Implements laws, makes rules, enforces laws, right? Congress is the institution of government that should be writing rules and laws, right? The president is the one that implements and enforces laws, right? So it's sort of pseudo legislative and pseudo executive, the bureaucracy. That's why in the textbook, Congress is the first chapter, political institutions, presidency second, and bureaucracy is third. Because bureaucracy is pseudo-legislative and pseudo-executive, right? And yet it's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Constitution for bureaucracy to have binding powers, right? And so how do you become a bureaucrat? For a lot of American history, to become a bureaucrat was really just to know the right people, right? And that changed with the Civil Service Act of 1883. This ended the spoils system. The spoils system was a system of government where, okay, if I want to work in government, if I want to work in a bureaucracy, I just needed the right connection. I just needed the right hookup, right? And that created a system of nepotism, right? Where, if you're a family member or you're a friend of someone in government, you are more likely to get that job, right? And that's just not fair, right? The Civil Service Act created this sort of exam that you took, which, as a result of the exam, it would demonstrate what you were qualified to, or what position in government you were qualified to have, right? And so it was really a hiring system based on merit, not nepotism or just connections you had, right? At higher levels of government, jobs are still filled with political appointees by the president, like cabinet secretaries, right? But political appointees by the president have to be approved by the Senate, right? And so there are different types of bureaucracies, right? Independent agencies are set up by Congress, right? In other words, Congress forms them, but the president still appoints who leads these agencies, and they have to be approved by the Senate, right? And they have broad powers that provide public services. Two main examples of independent agencies are NASA, right, and the CIA, right? Government corporations, right, are government agencies that perform market-oriented public services, right? In other words, it's an organization that the government creates, but provides a service that is mostly performed by the private sector. Biggest example of this is Amtrak, right? Amtrak is a government corporation. It's created by Congress, but it raises its own revenues to fund activities, right? And so, if you ever notice, I live in Pomona, right? If I want to go to LA, I can either take the Amtrak or I can take Metrolink. Metrolink is a government-funded train line goes, it's not a government corporation, right? It's fully funded by the government, right? By LA County and the state of California. That's why it's cheaper to ride on the Metrolink, right? Because it's supported by taxpayer dollars. Amtrak, on the other hand, might be of a higher caliber. It might be a nicer train. It might be a nicer interior, right? It was formed by the government, but you're paying, the fare you pay to ride that train helps sustain Amtrak on its own. And that's the difference between a government corporation and heavily government subsidized train line, right? And so those are government corporations. Independent regulatory commissions, or IRCs, those are rulemaking bodies that are supposed to be insulated from politics. In other words, their responsibility in itself is supposed to be one based on rulemaking, right? Based on evidence, based on science, not on politics, right? And so this picture of John Oliver, as you all know, I love John Oliver. He did an episode on the FCC chair, Ajit Pai. I don't know if you remember that. But he's the head of the FCC, and he was the guy behind ending net neutrality, right? And I just put this picture in because he's known to have this silly Reese's mug, and John Oliver just one-upped him by having a bigger Reese's cup mug, right? But so as we see with the FCC, right, and the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, these are supposed to be two bureaucracies in government, two independent regulatory commissions that are really supposed to help consumers. Right? In other words, the FCC, the whole thing with net neutrality is supposed to provide equal access and equal quality of internet speed to everybody, right? CFPB is supposed to protect consumers from not being scammed by banks and loan institutions that give you loans, right? And yet, in recent history, we've seen Trump wanted to shut down the CFPB. You've seen Ajit Pai really, and others in this FCC push for ending net neutrality, which they did, right, without public support. These are some institutions are supposed to be insulated from politics, and yet it seems as though they're not currently. So what are the goals of bureaucracy, right? In the United States, we live in a beautiful system of capitalism, right? The goal of federal bureaucracy is to maintain a strong economy, not by directly running the economy, but we have institutions like the IRS and the Federal Reserve, and these institutions regulate taxation, monetary policy, fiscal policy. They're not supposed to be political, right? And yet, with Trump, we've seen the sort of politicization of the Fed, right? The Fed is a major monetary agency that has authority over interest rates and lending activities, and yet we've seen Trump, have a back and forth with his own Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. Right? So primarily, the goal of federal bureaucracy is to maintain a strong economy. So I'm sorry about my image is getting in the way. And so people often complain about government being wasteful and not providing good service. And so over time, there's been reform in ways to try and improve government performance, either by reinventing bureaucratic procedures, terminating it, like getting rid of the administrative state, devolution, right, which we've talked about, right? Our whole beautiful system of federalism, right? The federal government giving their responsibilities primarily to states and localities, that's devolution. That would be limiting the size of the federal government, the federal bureaucracy, and giving responsibilities back to states and localities, right? That's been tried. And privatization, right? President Bush, Bush 43. With a Republican Senate and a Republican House, he tried to privatize parts of Social Security and failed, right? Because as we've talked about this semester, you don't touch Social Security, right? And if you try to, you're not going to win, right? And so primarily, on party lines, Democrats have aimed to make existing bureaucracy more effective, and Republicans have aimed to privatize certain levels of government. Right? Here she is, hands off Social Security and Medicare. Reducing the size of bureaucracy requires eliminating programs through termination, and that's what eliminating programs means, right? But it's rare, right? You hear people talk about it sometimes, and yet it never happens, because once you provide a benefit to Americans, it's hard to take it away, right? Americans that benefit from government programs will fiercely defend their favorite agencies, which makes terminating programs difficult, right? And with the whole coronavirus pandemic right now, you are seeing such weaknesses in things like our healthcare system, our unemployment benefits, our unemployment insurance system, right? And these are things that have to be fixed. And you hear Democrats talk about, how can we learn from this experience? How can we strengthen our healthcare system and our unemployment insurance system? And you hear Republicans saying, we need Band-Aids. We need to fix these things now. But ultimately, we don't want to completely overhaul these systems, right? And so that's a big dichotomy there. There's a difference of opinion between the parties. And how do we move forward from this travesty of a pandemic that we've been facing? Devolution, right? That means delegating programs from the federal level to state and local governments, right? And if you've been watching the daily press briefings with Trump, he talks a lot about this notion that, the federal government has its stockpile. States and localities, they need to reach out to local businesses and big business and to get their supplies they need to help combat this thing, right? And so you hear a lot of governors say, where's the federal government? We need supplies from high up to help battle this pandemic at state and local levels, right? And so that's been a big, if you've been following this thing, that's been a big issue with Trump and how he's handling this crisis. But devolution has its critics, right? And we talked about this in the federalism chapter, right? Opponents of devolution point out that state governments cannot run deficits. Right? In other words, this would lead to cuts in programs for low-income residents. If that state doesn't have, an income tax or a healthy stream of revenue to provide for its citizens, then devolution will make states go broke, and it will not provide programs for low-income residents. Right? So the coronavirus stimulus bill, right? It adds, the federal government is giving states $600 more per week for every person that files for unemployment. Do you realize what that means? Right? That means in California, where we have a pretty healthy unemployment insurance system, right? That's $600 more a week. It's helping everybody, right? But in California, a lot of people are going to be making more off unemployment than if they were working, right? As if you're in a state like Alabama or Mississippi where they don't really have a healthy unemployment insurance system, that $600 will go a long way, right? And that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's devolution right there. That's this federal government. Well, it's not devolution, it's federalism. I apologize. It's federalism in action. It's the federal government helping states and localities out in times of need, like right now during this pandemic. Proponents of devolution counter that it helps improve government efficiency, flexibility, and innovation. Right? In other words, if the federal government gives responsibilities to state and localities, then state and localities will be able to experiment with what works for their people. Right? Remember, we talked about Oakland, California, Santa Cruz, California, Denver, Colorado. These three localities decriminalized the use of shrooms, right? Maybe that works for those local communities. Right? The state of California has legalized recreational marijuana. Alabama has not, right? So that, in those cases, devolution gives states and localities the flexibility they need. Oversight is really, really important, right? It's an effort by Congress to exercise control over the activities of executive agencies, right? It's done through hearings, investigations, and other techniques. I apologize, this example is outdated. House Oversight Committee hearing with Michael Cohen. That's when Michael Cohen was working for Mr. Trump, and they had a hearing with him, and he testified about his dealings with the Trump administration. But any hearing that occurs in Congress is a form of oversight, right? And you see, if again, things that go viral for me and probably things that go viral for you are very different. But sometimes for me, I see oversight hearings with like the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. I think in the past month or so, she was testifying about they're trying to do away with protections for LGBT kids in schools, right? And this congresswoman was asking her, well, what are you going to do to protect these kids from bullying? And Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education. She said, well, we're going to let states and localities regulate that because every state, every school district, they have their own separate needs, right? And this congresswoman was very upset, saying, bullying at any level in any school district, any part of the country is wrong, and it requires leadership from the Department of Education, from you, the Secretary of Education. And I think she actually called on her to resign. That's a pretty heated hearing, right? But that's what hearings are. They are a form of oversight. So Congress has an idea of what these secretaries, what these executive agencies are doing, right? The GAO, the CRS, the CBO, these are all institutions within Congress that provide information, that provide information to Congress people. Right? Unbiased forms of information, science-based facts, right? Data, studies within Congress. And they are helpful for providing congressional oversight. Okay, so this reading, the Prostrita reading, it says that the modern administrative state is at odds with the Constitution. It was founded out of the New Deal, right? So in other words, his whole argument is that bureaucracy and administrative state are interchangeable terms. That what we have today, the multiple bureaucracies we have within government, right, was founded out of the New Deal. These agencies were created out of a necessity because of the crisis we were in under the Great Depression. Right? The New Deal was sort of this coronavirus stimulus package, but on steroids, right? It created it changed our whole system of government, really, by allowing broad discretionary authority. It gave bureaucracies and agencies I said pseudo before, quasi legislative powers and quasi judicial powers, right? In other words, they could create the rules and regulations they deemed necessary to run a government, right? And so these are the 6 sections that I want you to go over. I'll go through them pretty briefly, right? The introduction talks about the New Deal, how the New Deal launched large bureaucracy, broad governing authority, right? And that was independent of presidential control and political control. When they talk about the Chenery case, which was the SEC's exclusion of Chenery, was that the agency decided it was impermissible for management company to purchase stock during the reorganization of its company. Right? And then the SEC said courts must defer to outside experts to exercise judgment, right? In other words, the court said that the agency not refer to Congress or existing law, but outside experts in bureaucracy to exercise judgment. The rule of law would have to take a back seat to the social expediency provided by expert administration. What that means is the rule of law, right? Laws that were on the books, right, passed by Congress, binding rules and regulations, would have to, step aside to the social expediency provided by expert administration. Expert administration are people that are specialized in a particular area that are in bureaucracy. And bureaucracies are not, bureaucrats are not people that you vote in, right? Bureaucrats are people that are given control by, heads of agencies that the president appoints. So the president of the United States appoints people to run agencies, and then they can hire whoever they want based on expertise, right? And so this is more about the Chenery case. You could read that. Arbitrary government versus the rule of law, right? The Chenery case basically says that Congress gives vast discretionary legislative power to bureaucracy, people that are not voted into office, right? It's antithetical to the separation of powers, right? And so the rule of law facilitates government be the government by the consent of the governed, not outside agencies, right? In other words, the rule of law says that, or the rule of law is that we vote for people in Congress to create laws, right, based on the interest of their constituencies. We don't vote for bureaucrats that are in outside agencies, right? And so arbitrary rule makes it so government can pick favorites to benefit personal friends. This is a typo, I apologize. Let's just say arbitrary rule, put down here. Arbitrary rule on the whim, or rule of law, facilitates government by consent of the governed. Right? So the rule of law avoids the spoil system. Arbitrary rule, you give power to whoever is an expert in that field. Right? Okay. Separation of powers. Federalist number 47, right? Tyranny is the absence of separation of powers in government. Right? In other words, there can't be an accumulation of power in one branch of government. Right? And the responsibility of bureaucracy is given to the president. And remember the take care clause in Article 2? That makes the president strong. Right? So the growth in bureaucracy gives the president more power. Right? Well, okay. And so there's this dichotomy that you have to think about. The founders were in favor of separation of powers in our institutions. The progressives, not Bernie Bro progressives, but progressives from the 1910s rejected separation of powers. They thought it was outdated. They thought that the role of government should adjust with the demands of the time, right? They thought that it was deadly. It was a deadly obstacle to neoliberalism, right? The range of activities that progressives wanted was too broad for for Congress to handle under the original vision of legislative power, right? So you could apply it to society today, right? Bernie wants, Medicare for all. He wants to cancel student loan debt. He wants to create, tuition-free colleges and universities. These may seem like good things, right? And they are good things, right? But in terms of Congress's responsibilities, those are not in Article 1, Section 8, right? It's pretty broad, and you need more brain power in Congress to be able to handle complex issues like that, right? And so when you and so this is what the progressives want. They delegate rulemaking from Congress to bureaucracy, right? It eviscerates the notion of non-delegation. That expertise, you give power to experts because they have the ability to specialize, right? You insulate administration from the president and from politics, right? I'm not going to go over all this, right? You can read this, but Woodrow Wilson is the only U.S. president we've ever had with a PhD, and his dissertation was the separation of politics and administration. And again, he thought that the separation of powers was outdated, right? There was this fear that the permanent self-interestedness of human nature could make government administered by men over men, a threat to the natural rights of citizens, right? The framers did not deny discretionary power to the federal government. They understood that such discretion had to be channeled through the forms and laws of the Constitution in order to be safe for liberty, right? And for progressives, there was something special about civil servants, right? So again, this dichotomy between the founders and the progressives. The founders were what did they think of human nature? They thought human beings were self-interested, they were selfish, they were greedy, but they couldn't rule on their own. That's why we have a system of representative democracy, right? But progressives thought there was something special about civil servants, and that somehow raised above this ordinary self-interestedness of human nature. They had a more positive view of human nature. So there's that difference between the founders and the progressives in terms of how government should function and what human nature was like, right? And so the progressives, they thought we had to look at the new demands of people. They thought government was organic and that it had to grow with the times. The Constitution has to grow over time. Woodrow Wilson thought that the separation of powers was a hindrance to efficiency, right? That outside experts were better than a multiplicity of politicians. In other words, it would be better to have outside experts run government, make policy, instead of having 435 Congress people from all different parts of the country, right? He thought that administration should be freed from political influence, right? And so that's all I have to share from the PowerPoint. I did share I did share a video by one of my professors in graduate school. I'm trying to get to it. Okay, here it is. Right. Bless this man. He passed away in October from cancer. But I'm going to show you this video. Right? I posted it online, so you should be able to see it. But you know, if it's in here, you probably will watch it. But let's back up for a second. I went over a lot of material, right? And I apologize. I know I'm going over my 15 to 20 minute time frame, but this is important, right? Bureaucracy is outside of government, right? And it's created this debate within politics between people that are with the founders or with the progressives, right? And that the founders want to focus on the institutions we have, such as Congress, right? It's strengthening Congress to do things that our modern bureaucracies do. And progressives believe that Congress is too political, that's why we don't get anything done. And they like the fact that outside experts, people that are not in government, have power in government, right? Because they weren't elected, to create rules and regulations based on their expertise. And so my professor, Dr. Yeoman, was not a fan of the progressives, right? Ronald Pistrito is not a fan of the progressives. But based on my lecture, the textbook and PowerPoint, and parts of the reading by Pistrito, I want you to be able to think about how our institutions have evolved over time. Maybe you are pro-administrative state. Maybe you're anti-administrative state. But I want you to be able to reflect on how our government has grown over time. What has war, emergency, disaster, what has that done to the powers of our institutions? And is there still public trust in our institutions? So I'm going to show you this video, and then we're going to end it there. Thank you guys for listening.
Paul, the administrative state, begins with a philosophical critique of the American founding, which really had three prongs to it. led by this group of people we have come to call the progressives. The critique was that nature, in the sense of natural rights, imposed undue restrictions on the ability of the Constitution to do what they believed people wanted it to do. That history, capital H, had moved on, that the American founders were unduly dedicated to the idea of nature, natural rights, and limited government. But that government, in fact, was an evolutionary kind of thing that needed to adapt to particular circumstances. The spiritual godfather in America of that indictment was Woodrow Wilson, Professor Woodrow Wilson. Long before he entered politics, wrote a series of essays and books specifically attacking the American founders and the separation of powers in particular. The idea was that separation of powers imposed very severe constraints as to what the government might do. My concern, which I mentioned at the panel, is that we have now, partly for accidental reasons, created a presidential election system in which, for all intents and purposes, we have a plebiscitary presidency. That is to say, he is selected by a primary system and enjoys a large degree of popular support. We now combine that with the powers of a very large administrative state over which a president has a good deal of discretionary authority. You put together the idea of a plebiscitary president with lots of bureaucratic and potentially arbitrary power, and you have a recipe for democratic demagoguery. And that, I think, is the central threat facing the American constitutional system at the moment. And it's going to require all three branches to undo that.
He's great, and I miss him so much. But thank you for watching today. I know this is a hefty one, but please contact me, email your SI leader or your TA if you have any questions about the material covered today. And be safe. I will see you guys soon on here, of course.